Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to day 2 of the virtual conference on religion and democracy on the African continent, colonial legacies and post-colonial possibilities. My name is Cynthia Haler-Faton, and I am a faculty member in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. I am most grateful to Professor Ogunaike and Professor Vinson for inviting me to chair this morning's panel, which is titled Contemporary Conflicts, the State and Religion in Africa. As the conference website indicates, and as those of you who were with us all know, yesterday all know, the general thrust of yesterday's discussion was looking back. Professor Mamdani's superb keynote address and the 10 exceptional papers that followed analyzed the formation of religious movements and leadership and religious and cultural identities as they intersected with various kinds of political mobilization, state formation, and democratic projects. The scholars who shared their work offered illuminating insights into these colonial and early post-colonial era dynamics, all with an eye toward assessing their relevance for the present and the future. Today's panelists will pick up on many of these same threads as they look forward and consider current religious, political, and democratic trends and their implications for envisioning future possibilities on the African continent and beyond. Contemporary African societies and polities are sites of profound paradoxes and contradictions. They are described as both post-colonial and neocolonial, both deeply religious and challenging definitions of religious, and as both profoundly democratic and anti-democratic. The papers in this morning's panel all demonstrate how thinking from African contexts and with African categories and case studies can provide a rethinking of political and intellectual possibilities that illuminate, critique, and may even resolve current contradictions within Western ideals, practices, and institutions. We will keep the same format as yesterday, with each panelist speaking for 10 minutes, followed by a 5-minute Q&A. If time allows at the end, we will open it up after everybody has presented. We will open it up for more questions. And now it is my great honor to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have Jacob Olupona, whose paper is entitled Structural Oversight in Democratic Process, Indigenous Traditions in African Nation Building. Jacob K. Olupona is Professor of African Religious Traditions at Harvard Divinity School and Professor of African and African American Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. He studied at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and Boston University, where he received his PhD in comparative religion. He is currently working on a new groundbreaking study of the explosive growth of evangelicalism across all branches of Christianity in Nigerian society, expanding the current discourse that is largely focused on Pentecostalism. Olupona has authored or edited numerous books, including Kinship, Religion, and Rituals in the Nigerian Community, a phenomenological study of Ondo-Yoruba festivals, and The City of 201 Gods, Ile-Ife in Time, Space, and the Imagination, which examines the modern urban mixing of ritual, royalty, gender, class, and power, and how the structure and content of religious beliefs and practices permeate daily life. His most recent edited volume, Ifa Divination, Knowledge, Power, and Performance, analyzes the famous Ifa divination tradition from various perspectives, including theology, philosophy, and art and aesthetics. Professor Olupona has received prestigious grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Philosophical Society, the Ford Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation, to name just a few. He has served on many editorial boards and was president of the African Association for the Study of Religion. Professor Olupona has received numerous honors, including the highest distinction the Nigerian government bestows on civilians, the Nigerian Order of Merit, and he was inducted into the Nigerian Academy of Letters in 2015. Our second panelist is Abdul Qadir Tayyub, whose paper is entitled Thinking of a Moral Economy of Islam with Ibn Khaldun. Abdul Qadir Tayyub is Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Cape Town and holds a National Research Foundation Chair in Islam, African Publics, and Religious Values. He holds a PhD from Temple University in the US, and he is the author of numerous books, including Religion in Modern Discourse, Islam in South Africa, Mosques, Imams, and Sermons, and Islamic Resurgence in South Africa, the Muslim Youth Movement, to name a few. He has also worked and published on the history of religions and discourses of contemporary Islam, Muslim schooling, and Islam in public life in Africa. His current research projects focus on religious studies and Islamic intellectual history, on religious education in South Africa, and on religion and ethics in societies and religious traditions. Our third presenter is Hadiza Kere Abdurrahman, whose paper is entitled Politics, Power, and Quranic Schooling in Northern Nigeria, Contesting Legitimacies and Contested Knowledges. Dr. Abdulrahman is Senior Lecturer in Inclusive Education at Bishop Grosseteste University in the UK. She holds a PhD in education from the University of Lincoln. She researches the Almuljaranchi system of education in Northern Nigeria. She is interested in the ways that colonialism and coloniality shape narratives about education in post-colonial societies and affect how we come to know the things we know. Dr. Abdulrahman also co-owns a nursery and primary school in Minna in Niger State, Nigeria. Our fourth presenter is Husseina Ali-Doo, whose paper is entitled Neoliberal Democracy, the COVID-19 Pandemic, and Muslim Ethics of Care, Hausa Poetics of Compassion and Resistance. Husseina Ali-Doo is Professor of African Languages and Literatures in the Department of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Languages and Literatures, and the Graduate Program in Comparative Literature at Rutgers University. She is a theoretical linguist whose research focuses mainly on the study of women's orality and literacy practices in African Muslim societies, African Muslim women's agency and gender justice, African women's literatures, and gender discourses of identity and the politics of cultural production in African Muslim societies. She has authored and co-edited numerous books, including Writing Through the Visual and Virtual, Inscribing Language, Literature, and in Francophone Africa, and Culture in Africa and the Caribbean, co-edited with Renée Leryea. She has also authored Muslim Women in Postcolonial Kenya, Representation, Leadership, and Social Change, and Engaging Modernity, Muslim Women and the Politics of Agency in Postcolonial Niger, which was the runner-up for the Edu Snyder Book Prize from the Women's Caucus of the African Studies Association. She is currently working on a project called Gender, Islam, and Popular Culture in the Sahel. Our fifth presenter, well, actually our fifth presenter was to be Elias Kifon-Bongba. Unfortunately, he is not able to make it. So Professor Oludamini Ogunaike will present his paper. But do let me say a little bit about Professor Bongba. His paper today will be titled Political and Public Theology in Africa Today. Professor Bongba is the Harry and Hazel Chavan Chair in Christian Theology and Professor and Chair of Religion at Rice University. Professor Bongba combines his teaching of African religions and his research in theology and philosophy of religion, working with African philosophical ideas and continental philosophy. He is the author of 4 books, including African Witchcraft and Otherness, a philosophical and theological critique of intersubjective relations, The Dialectics of Transformation in Africa, which won the 2007 Frantz Fanon Prize for Outstanding Work in Caribbean Thought. He is also the author of Facing a Pandemic, The African Church and the Crisis of AIDS. And finally, Witchcraft as Social Diagnosis, Traditional Ghanaian Beliefs and Global Health. Professor Bongba is also the editor of the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to African Religions and the Rutledge Companion to Christianity in Africa. So now I think we would like to move right away to Professor Jacob Olupona. Welcome, Professor.
I'm trying to, okay. Can you see me now? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Cynthia. And let me also thank the organizers of the conference, Ogunaike and Vincent, for inviting me. In an article I wrote and delivered in 2013, entitled Bonds, Boundaries, and Bondage of Faith, I recalled a time when religion constituted one of the strongest bonds that united recently independent African states and served as one of our greatest assets and hope. This engagement with religion was rooted in indigenous sensibilities that did not perceive alternative religious traditions as a competitive threat, but rather alternative means of accomplishing a shared goal. Sadly, that period in the 60s and part of 70s was not to last, and religion became a matter of delineating boundaries between members of the same community as the place of indigenous religious traditions was compromised, following their broad categorization from many quarters as demonic, pagan, retrogressive, etc. The end result for us today is that religion often constitutes a major source of national bondage that keeps African states marred in dissension, factionalism, and violence in the most extreme cases. Even a cursory glance at the traditions that constitute Africans' triple heritage, Islam, Christianity, and indigenous religion, makes it abundantly clear that they are deeply concerned with the liberation of human beings from bondage in many ways. For example, sin, the tyranny of nafs, or malevolent spiritual forces, like illness, demons, or jinns, and even the tyranny of state violence and abuse of power. So hence, the problem is not religion per se, even if a critical part of the problem is indeed religious in nature. In reminiscing on the time when African states had a more productive engagement with religion, I am always struck by the fact that indigenous cosmologies, worldviews, and religious norms were integrated into those political projects, and that their rejection was closely followed by the disintegration of effective nation building. I propose that any serious attempts to rectify this dire situation must take indigenous traditions seriously again. In much of my work, I have analyzed how indigenous African traditions oftentimes seamlessly blended a type of civil religion as expanded by Robert Bellah. By civil religion, Bellah does not mean a worship of the state in exactly the same way as one might worship God or lesser deities. It instead implies a common set of myths, rituals, and values that are shared and cultivated by the entire group. In traditional African societies, these various religious traditions could often come together in service of such a project, and the political offices of title holders, such as the Yoruba Oba, the sacred kings or monarch, serve as an excellent example. Without an idea of any competing religious cosmology, practitioners of indigenous traditions in any area would all naturally be invested in the success of their political system. When paired with the lack of any meaningful separation between the sacred and secular or religious and politics, civil religion could emerge naturally from shared myths of origin and communal engagement with whatever religious, political traditions and ethical system proved most effective or useful. Interestingly, the introduction of Islam and Christianity did not necessarily undermine the ability to forge a civil religion in African societies, but its increasing contentious nature of interreligious relations and recent articulations of politics as a battle for the soul of a nation certainly have made any effort at a pluralistic civil religion doomed to fail. And I must emphasize here that we must take a kind of a historical approach to understand where we are in this state and where this mess, when this mess began. Peter Eke takes Nigeria as a case in point in order to identify two publics at work in African nations: the primordial public, which authenticates cultural context, and the civics public, which emerged from colonialism. The nature of citizenship changes depending on the public within which one participates. Ake's discourse on this topic contrasts Western ideals about duties and rights, issues ensuring from the dialectics of the two publics include tribalism, voluntary associations, and embezzlement, etc. I've given particular attention to Ake's work because of the crisis of corruption in Africa's public life. And here, despite conversion to Islam and Christianity, and apparently an increase in public professions of spirituality, the exogenous faiths seem not to have succeeded in reordering the public life as it relates to citizens' obligation to their community and to themselves. While it is impossible to revert back to the state of primordial public, it seems to me that Africans need a new social ethic derived from the very faith Africans have taken pains to convert to and create a new type of primordial public, because it was precisely within this primordial public that we were able to forge an effective civil religion in the past. Unfortunately, at the moment, we lack the type of visionary leadership of central figures who could think of ways to galvanize nations around a central ideology that will propel change and development or recreate the civics public more in the model of the primordial public. Responses to development on the continent tend to be ad hoc, a fire brigade-like interventions, and we are in desperate need of leaders who can galvanize the nation state to a more positive reorientation and purposeful goals. However, where does one find such leaders? And while some like Rwanda's Paul Kagame have achieved incredible success by some development metrics, he's not without his critics. And all Africanists can recognize that the quality of national leaders African states enjoyed during the era of independence is sadly long gone. Allow me now to give an example of how at least one of these historic leaders was able to leverage indigenous traditions in the service of civil religion and effective nation building and development. Julius Nyerere had the right attitude to governance and nation building. By promoting the unifying ideology of Ujamaa in 1967, the Arusha Declaration, Nyerere demonstrated the potential for citizens of the nation of Tanzania to galvanize around one indigenous ideology. The nominal form of Ujamaa or Mjamaa was coined to represent the model citizen. Every Tanzanian was expected to aspire to the status of Mjamaa. The Mjamaa was expected to follow the Ujamaa ideology to its full extent, as his adherence to the national ideology was essential to the nation building process. This process took a socialist phase that sought economic transformation through the censor of various forms of mediation and tribal loyalties in economic affairs. The Mjamaa was to promote a keen sense of national consciousness, which involved converting tribal mentalities to a national one and adopting Swahili as a national language. The aim was not to develop a Tanzanian culture, which would pull together the best aspects. The aim was to develop a Tanzanian culture, which will put together the best aspects of the country's indigenous belief system. Initially, this scheme garnered significant success, including creation of a one-party system and central democracy, the abolition of discrimination based on religion and ethnicity, the vigilant oversight of production, and the implementation of free and compulsory education for all Tanzania. This movement resonated with Tanzania because it rejected the colonial legacy and adopted an African intellectual identity. I must point out here that I am not saying that this was the best or that Nyerere did not make mistakes, but Nyerere, unlike some of our current leaders, had the vision to move his country forward, to suggest something, to experiment, and this experiment was towards a kind of a nation building. So sadly, many merely assume that there will be a gradual and natural move from ethnic to civics identity and political organization in the new African nation state. But without clear and most importantly, sustained projects and a sense of civil religion, such as Nyerere sought to cultivate, this development never materialized. As a result, theorists frequently left out religion in the new dispensation of the state along Western secular lines, which sadly exacerbated many of the moral and social issues, and on top of it all, made it very unclear precisely how politics could and should interact with religion, particularly in pluralistic cultural contexts, as we find in most African countries. So naturally, this was a huge oversight and major political issues, since religion remained a major driving force in the lives of vast majority of Africans, and one that could never be relegated to some imagined private spheres. The end result, of course, is what we often see on the continent today, namely very weak national ethos, perfectionary gestures towards civic identity and life, and a largely disordered and unstructured interaction between religious institutions and leaders and political power. Loyalty and at times even fanatical support for religious institutions is on the rise, while any belief in the state as a legitimate means of improving society is rapidly evaporating. By reasserting the place of religion in nation building and the place of indigenous religions in particular, a more positive relationship between politics, civics, religion, and religion can certainly be established. Nyeri's ideology of Ujamaa and the identity of the Ujamaa were not at all at odds with a citizen's practice of Christianity or Islam. And I'm sure most would agree that they were completely compatible with Christian and Muslim values at the very least, and more likely, they should be mutually reinforcing. Although it will require creativity and a high level of religious literacy in all traditions present in a particular country, such a project could be articulated in such a way that the processes and purposes of civil religion will support the efforts of citizens in their religious life, becoming a better citizen implicated in the process of becoming a better adherent of each respective religious tradition. The prophetic aspect of indigenous tradition, Islam and Christianity, in condemning corruption, moral decadence, and oppression in all its myriad forms create ample opportunity for the alignment of good governance and the dictates of Africa's multiple religious traditions. However, while Islam and Christianity are often invoked in the public sphere through token gestures, such as swearing on the Bible or the Quran, to serve the state faithfully and not steal money, the traditions indigenous societies have developed over centuries still carry greater height. If those same politicians who lie with their hands on the Bible and the Quran were taken to a traditional shrine, say of Ogun in Nigeria, and asked to swear not to steal before the ancestors and deities, it will magically become much easier to account for public funds. While I would not rate most African countries highly in aligning the goals and functions of religious and political institutions, I believe there are important examples of instances in which the spiritual cultivation of citizens manifests itself in good and effective political order. We can give the example of Senegal as perhaps as a particular nation state that had different religious orders, the Mouridiya brotherhoods, the Tijaniya brotherhoods. And when you ask the Senegalese why things have been, good for them, at least compared with Nigeria, they will most likely say to you that is the result of the baraka, the blessings and divine presence of many holy sheikhs who were involved in establishing peace while they were alive and continue to do so even now. The question still remains, where do such transformation now leaders, both religious, as in the case of Senegalese sheikhs, such as Amadou Bamba, Ibrahim Nais, or political leaders such as Julius Nyerere, Kwame Nkrumah, or both, as in the case of the recently deceased Desmond Tutu? Where did they come from? I think it is significant that each of these figures was deeply steeped in their local traditions. And even if they were exposed to modern educational system, they all excelled in part because of their rootedness in the traditional form of person formation. And as Peter Eke observed, colonialism on the other
Professor
hand.
Olopona, I'm sorry. This is Cindy. I'm going to have to ask you to maybe move toward your conclusion quickly, just
Okay,
because in the interests of time. I'm so sorry.
that is fine. Don't worry. You don't have to apologize for that. In conclusion, I am of the opinion that the project of nation building is so profound, and it behoves on leaders and citizens to begin to look at how important this whole concept of civil religion is, so that together they can be very creative in promulgating ideas and traditions and customs that will continue to bring their nation states together. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that
You're welcome.
inspiring and provocative talk. Members of the audience and panelists, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A. I see that we already have a question for Professor Olupona. This comes from Olufemi Taiwo. Professor Olupona, it makes sense that the refusal by some to craft a civil religion in the manner that Nyerere did was a mistake. But now that it has been made, do you think it is still possible to reconcile civil religion with differences in religion after tensions between religious factions?
Well, do you want me to respond to that?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you, Professor Taiwo, for such a question. I mentioned earlier on that we need to take a kind of a historical approach to that. And the article I cited earlier on, bonds, boundaries, and bondage of faith, will illustrate in the case of Nigeria how we have moved from that past stage when religion, true to its name, religare, to bond. It was a uniting factor and a unifying factor. And now, of course, we have found ourselves in a state where it has become a bondage. I think it is very difficult, but it's doable. In Nigeria, for example, the example that I cited is constantly looking for ways to see how they can develop unifying value systems, like perhaps a central ideology that will, galvanize its 360 ethnic groups to achieving forms of unity. And of course, as you know, Professor Femi, from your own work on modernity, that the ingredients are there. Is the inability to practice the kinds of federalism that will unite them. So we can, in fact, discuss, maybe argue, that federalism in a religious sense or in the civil religion sense, it's a solution to the problem that I have proposed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In the interests of time, we are going to, I hope we will have time to answer more questions, and panelists, you will receive questions that have been posed to you. They'll be sent to you so you can follow up later if need be. We would like now to move to our second panelist, Professor Abdul Qadir Tayoub.
Thank you very much for this great opportunity to think about the relationship between religion and politics, and also to think about it in the future. My paper is focusing on the economy. I think that we've heard quite a bit about the politics, but I think I'd like to bring a little bit of attention to the economy. But I'm not an economist. I'm not talking about economics in general. What I have decided to do is thinking about the moral economy with Ibn Khaldun, and I'll suggest to you why I'm bringing Ibn Khaldun. We've seen the idea of moral economy was raised by E.P. Thompson in an essay in 1971, referring to the development of, or the introduction of, a market economy, a capitalist market economy in the 18th century. And he suggested that there were a number of people or groups, for example, including riots, so-called bread riots that opposed the new market economy. And E.P. Thompson provided a kind of a broad definition of what he calls the moral economy, suggesting it was grounded upon a consistent traditional view of social norms and obligations, of the proper economic functions of several parties within the community, which taken together can be said to constitute the moral economy of the poor. Now, what I want to do, underline in this introductory, remark that I'm making is that the idea of a moral economy was brought up, in a particular crisis, and in this time it is a crisis that is, produced, or at least that is instigated by the introduction of a market economy. Fast forward all the way to the 21st century, we know that since 2008, this idea of moral economy has again become quite salient, not only among people who are opposed to the excesses of capitalism, and particularly financial capitalism from 2008 until now, but also within capitalism itself, the idea that perhaps moral economy could be a kind of a correction to what is going on in the economy. Now, the question that I wanted to pose for myself, at least in general, I'm not going to be obviously able to answer all these questions, but I think we need to ask ourselves, given the fact that the moral economies, emerge in the context of crisis, are these moral economies actually possible? More particularly, I want to put the question on the moral economies of religion, because what I found in the literature in the last maybe 10 years or so, there's a lot of talk about moral economy, but one of the areas which is actually lacking in general is the moral economies of religion. I mean, there are a few essays by Webb Keane and others, but generally we have much more work that is done on the religions of the market rather than the economies of the religion. And so my second question is that if I have an answer, I have some kind of a proposal to make about why is it that these are difficult to conceive, and so therefore I'd like to propose that perhaps we need to think out of the box, perhaps, and I'd like to do that with Ibn Khaldun. So as I said, quite a number of scholars, including E.P. Thompson, James Scott, and more recently Webb Keane, emphasize that the moral economy is a concept, as an idea, is proposed in opposition to the capitalist market economy. So the moral economy takes the form of resistance, and it also, there's a certain sense in which the moral economy is much more of a promise than actually a reality. It's not, doesn't really, certainly in the context of a capitalist market economy, there are some good ideas, but it's very difficult to, at least somebody like E.P. Thompson, but also James Scott, who wrote extensively on peasant economies, for example, writes about the fact that when the arrival of a modern market economy, the moral economy of the past seems to be disappearing and being destroyed as such. And I myself started looking at the studies that have been done in the last maybe 20 or 30 years on, not so much on what is officially called moral economies, but on Islamic economics, particularly because that is our area of research. When you look at these studies, the studies invariably say that, for example, the Waqf endowments of the 19th century were destroyed by the emerging capitalist economy. In the 1970s and 80s, when Islamic economics was proposed by new groups of Muslim intellectuals and groups, for example, in Pakistan or in parts of Africa, particularly the study of Holger Weiss in Ghana, there's a sense in which they say that this Islamic economics did not really succeed. Or charitable organizations, studies of charitable organizations point out that these are just nothing but neoliberal identities that are being promoted through the at least through the symbol, through the identities of religion as such. So I came out with this, looking at this literature, I came with the sense that actually maybe we need to think about why is it that moral economies of religion or any other kinds of cultural traditions are not able to survive. And I'd like to, as my first sort of suggestion for this paper, suggest that perhaps we need to think about Max Weber's theses, these theoretical reflections on the relationship between religion and the and the economy as perhaps giving us an idea, not necessarily what the world looks like, what the world in which we are living looks like, but looking at theoretical arguments, or at least theoretical positions that actually tell us how the world is shaped in a particular way. It sort of reminds me of what Marx said. The point is not necessarily to envision the world, but to actually project something into the future. And I'd like to start with the first of Max Weber's thesis, which is the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, where he made almost a kind of a deterministic relationship between, religion, in this case, the Protestant ethic, and the rise of capitalism. We know that the other side of it was to say that he said other religious traditions or other kinds of ethics could not have given rise to capitalism. But I'm more interested in the first part, where he says that there is a relationship, almost like a kind of a definite relationship, or a kind of perhaps one can speak about it as a deterministic relationship between the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. And that idea is very much, sitting in the idea of moral economies, from Thompson all the way to people who speak about Islamic economics, that because there has to be certain kind of religious values or certain kinds of religious practices, there has to be that sort of finds itself in the economy, or it doesn't, or as such. There's a kind of a relationship there that was underlined by Max Weber's thesis, and that is then still implicitly followed in other studies as well. But I think that we cannot only sit with this thesis of Max Weber. One also needs to take the other thesis of his, which is about the disenchantment of the world. That he suggested that once that the Protestant ethic has set in motion, capitalism and modern state formation, that leads to what he argued was a disenchantment of the world. And we know that Max Weber became very pessimistic about the future of the world. And so I think the second thesis points to the impossibility of any kind of ethics, or any kind of ethics, particularly in the moral economy as such. So I feel that this, maybe we need to think about this thesis as a kind of a vision for the world, not necessarily of the world, and in the way that how our theoretical reflections basically are, almost like attuned to thinking about the economy in a particular way, in a kind of a dominant tradition, which makes it's very difficult the idea of a moral economy. So with those comments, let me turn to now Ibn Khaldun. As you know, is a great 14th century intellectuals who made comments about many things. I mean, he wrote a great philosophy of history. I look specifically, and I want to share with you some comments of his on what I would call a moral economy. Obviously, he didn't use the term, but he wrote a book on acquiring sustenance, ma'ash in Arabic. He wrote a section on how people acquire some form of access to in order to sustain themselves, in order to live, basically, economy of life as such. And there are 3 points that I'd like to raise. I hope in enough, with sufficient, not with that kind of detail, but sufficient to give you a sense of how he was thinking about what we would call economy. The first is his privileging of 2 important terms that he thought is quite central to humans acquiring sustenance. The first term is called rizq, which means the sustenance given by God. And second term that he used is kasb, is the idea of human acquisition, both of Arabic terms. And I think Ibn Khaldun sort of rethought about an Ash'arite theological positions, which brought together in a very close and almost very difficult to differentiate between the human and the divine in the production of human sustenance. But he did say that the rizq is almost a kind of a guarantee by God that sustenance is provided for all living creatures as such. And I think this is a kind of what Ayman Rida calls a kind of economy of abundance, as opposed to the economy of scarcity that I think we normally think about economics today. The second point that I want to make about Ibn Khaldun, he discusses various kinds of professions, and also he engages in some kind of deliberations about this. Let me just mention some of those. He mentions, for example, agriculture, trade, and manufacture as 3 major forms of acquiring sustenance. He sort of puts a little bit of doubt on politics, interestingly. I mean, there's no doubt he sort of debates with other scholars during his time or earlier to him who were saying that politics is also, that means, taxation might also be a way of acquiring sustenance, but Ibn Khaldun doesn't explain why, but he sort of is a bit hesitant about accepting politics as such. Interestingly, Ibn Khaldun doesn't mention charity as a source of acquiring sustenance. Normally, when we think about it today about moral economy, I mean, I'm looking at the discussion, one always think about, I think there's a tendency, there might be a tendency, I'm not so sure, but there might be a tendency to think about charity as a very central part of a moral economy. Ibn Khaldun doesn't mention that at all, for example. And I can perhaps speculate about why he does that. The last point, I want to do a little bit of elaboration on what he thinks about trading. It's a very interesting thing because Ibn Khaldun has been sometimes celebrated as somebody who is a precursor to capitalism. But I think when you look more carefully at his work, for example, he sort of speaks in the way of the capitalist, but at the same time tends to go against it as such. So let me wrap up as such, but if I could just use 1 minute in order to say something about it. So Ibn Khaldun thinks about trading as a natural human activity, but trading is somewhat marred by cunning and gambling. So for example, he sort of speaks about prices, he speaks about how human beings acquire value, acquire sustenance through trading. He's got a lot of good things to say about trading, but he intersperses it with some kind of caution about that, for example. He says prices, for example, should never actually be controlled because prices are controlled by God. But then when he speaks about the sustenance, basic food sustenance, he sort of says, no, those are the things that you should actually bring it up. We should actually introduce some kind of limits. Because he doesn't say why, but somehow I think that he has in mind the principle that he has presented as a kind of in terms of the idea of sustenance as such. So let me present some kind of a conclusion. I think the moral economy is really a good place to begin to think about, an alternative economy in the contemporary context, but particularly as we are speaking about in African context as such. But perhaps we need to also face the reality that the world is structured in such a way that moral economies might be resistant economies, but not real economies. And so I've presented to you the kind of the vision of Max Weber, perhaps, as a way of not necessarily determining that impossibility, but telling us more or less the kind of bind that in which we find ourselves in, with a kind of a global economy that has such a dominant position. And so therefore, I'm thinking that maybe we need to start thinking about moral economies, not from the current context, but actually look at places outside the modern economy to begin to think about alternative ways. I think there's a lot that one has to do a lot with Ibn Khaldun, but I think he gives us some ideas of thinking about economies from a different perspective. I think his idea of risk and kasb as both human and divine actually introduces a very different kind of foundation from which to begin. And finally, I think his understanding of economics is not a deterministic idea of the economy determined by religion, as we could see. He has a very expansive idea of the economy, but what he does is that in his deliberation of the different professions, in his deliberation of trading, for example, he seems to tell us that you can actually begin to insert values in economy as such, not so much in a kind of a deterministic way, but in a way that basically makes you responsible for them. I thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much for that provocative and fascinating talk. Do we have any questions from the participants or the audience? I'll give you a minute maybe to enter your questions, type your questions in the Q&A, please, not the chat. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions, so I will, okay, I guess, Oludamini, I gather that you would like to ask a question, correct? Please,
yes,
please feel free.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is very, very rich, very, very interesting presentation. My head's going in about 5 different directions. From this, a lot of different possibilities it brings up. one thing it brings to minds, it reminds me of Wael Halak's recent engagement with Taha Abdurrahman, a kind of different formation of morality in terms of knowledge and ethics. So I wanted to ask if you see any if you're engaged with that project at all. Another thing it brought up to mind was the difference between the economy of abundance and the economy of scarcity, and the kind of vastly different orientation between what you're presenting from Ibn Khaldun and the typical Malthusian. I mean, Malthus was also was a priest, but we have a very different kind of orientation towards the world, towards sustenance, towards abundance in Malthus versus what you're presenting here with Ibn Khaldun. And then the final question, which you started to address at the end, was the practical question. How can we incubate these kinds of moral economies in the hostile environment of global market capitalism that is completely inimical to these kinds of practices and ideas?
Great question. Thank you so much. All three very long, so I try to keep them brief. I think the first one, Taha Abdurrahman's question is, I mean, his project is a great. I know something about it. I'm trying to engage with it, as we speak. But I think it's very much directed to a critique of modernity, and also a development of a virtue ethics as such. So I haven't seen any kind of immediate connection with the economy. I think certainly I can see it coming up, but perhaps I'm not necessarily familiar with that. The second, the last question, I forgot the second one, but the last question I want to maybe just jump to that and come to the yes, you asked about the question of the economy of abundance. Yeah, I really think that I'm taking a cue from my interpretation of that is from Ayman Rida, who's written a really interesting book on prophets and prophets, with the two kinds of prophets. I would recommend that because he sort of draws a long history of these two different kinds of economies, and the modern economy really based on abundance, in spite of the fact that we have so much of value that is created through technology and through globalization. We still are sitting with the fact that we have everything is scarce, for example. And I think that just changing that idea around to think about, even if we just have the same kind of economy, but we start thinking about abundance, then I think maybe we have a completely different orientation. I think the third question is quite important. I don't have an answer to that, but what I do think is that I'm not so sure whether I did start off looking at the literature, and the literature telling me that there is no moral economy, but I feel that we have missed this opportunity to actually look for it, because religions particularly, we've looked at identities, we looked at conflict, but we haven't looked at how the kind of cooperation and the kind of work that goes on. So my position is that I wish I had done that. Our normal position is with as far as economics is concerned, we look at what is the impact of finance, who has the money, and so therefore who makes a decision. But underneath that, we actually see a lot of sharing taking place. Well, we see moral economies, but we have somehow, at least I've been blind to it, but I think a lot of my friends and colleagues have also been blind to that as well. Noah Solomon, I don't know if there's a chance for me to say something briefly on the question. Noah is asking a question about why Ibn Khaldun rejects charity as part of his moral economy. Yeah, he doesn't necessarily reject it, he just doesn't mention it, right? So that's why I just flagged that. What he does say is that anybody who lives he lives a life depending on somebody else. He thinks that person is not necessarily as virtuous as somebody who doesn't do that. So he's got a very strong sense of the fact, murua, the Arabic sense that you have to basically go out and be prepared to help other people. So maybe that's why he doesn't want to talk about charity, because it doesn't fit within his particular framework of understanding morality. But what I think is that the reason why he doesn't want to do that is because, in a way, I think that giving charity is really being like God, if I can put it like that, taking the place of God, giving sustenance to others. So in a way, I think that he is opening up that space as such for things. I mean, even though it's a space by omission rather than by commission. But I'll have to give some thought about that.
Thank you so much. we will have to draw this question and answer period, this brief period to a close and move on to our next speaker. We will now hear from Dr. Abdul Rahman.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? I need to ask because if everything that could go wrong went wrong today. I'm going to try and share my slides. So hopefully that works. Can you all see it?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
I should also add that the slides are really just for my benefit more than other people, is to kind of guide me in what I do. Yeah, the title of my presentation today is Politics, Power, and Quranic Schooling in Northern Nigeria, Contesting Legitimacies and Contested Knowledges. And that's interesting. Oh, there we go. I'm going to start by way of a brief introduction. My name is Dr. Hadiza Kiri Abdurrahman, and I lecture in special and inclusive education at Bishop Grosseteste University. I love how you stumbled on that. Everyone that I know stumbles on Bishop Grosseteste. It's a small university in the East Midlands in the UK. This is my Twitter account. I should add that you follow at your peril. I do not just tweet academic stuff, I tweet all kinds of things. And today, especially, I'd really like to draw from my previous research. So I finished my doctorate in 2017, and I researched the Al-Majuranchi system of Northern Nigeria. This is an alternative system of classical Quranic schooling that is predominant all over Northern Nigeria. And this is where I'm theorizing from. But I have a caveat for that. So while today I'm pulling from that and trying to understand the formation of Northern or Nigerian elite, it's really from trying to understand Al-Majuranchi and the practitioners that led me to kind of explore some of the psyche of Western school Nigerians like me, which brings me to my positionality. I cannot tell you that I'm theorizing about the elites in Northern Nigeria without at least alluding to the fact that I may belong to this group of people. I'm Western schooled. Today, I'm really looking at Western schooling as the nexus or the locus of power relations in post-colonial societies. So I am complicit. I am part of the elite that I critique very often, in the hope that it's very much like looking at yourself in the mirror. We like to think that people like the Al-Majiri that I study are the ones worthy of study. We tend to study other people or others, whereas maybe what we really should be looking at is ourselves in the mirror. So this is where I'm coming from. The next thing I'm going to do is by way of acknowledgement. And this is really just acknowledging the relationality between us. When I got an invite to speak, I quickly said yes. And then I panicked. I panicked when I saw all the other names that were presenting as alongside me, people that I really, really hold in high esteem. My auntie Husseina Alidu, we've got Abdul Basit, Professor Ogunnaiki, Professor Mamdani. So I am, in the spirit of that, acknowledging the relationality between us. I'm here because of you all. I saw Alex Thurston and I used his work in trying to understand the formation of Nigerian elite alongside Anas Omar and Baba. And I thought, oh my God, I need to go back and read his paper just to make sure that I haven't misrepresented him. So I'm thanking those who have spoken before me and those who I'm pulling from. I also like to say that I'm not the expert in what I do. I am but a humble scholar. So wherever I may be wrong, please forgive me. This is just me trying to think a bit out of the box. I have to acknowledge my niece. She's helped me with my laptop today. Honestly, I would have melted down. So in the spirit of relationality as well. General housekeeping. I'll be mentioning a lot about Western schooling, Western education. The way I employ it here, it's secular. It's based on Anglo-European epistemology, and it's been inherited through the Colonial project. And it's understood to be modern and progressive in Nigeria. That's the context within which I'm using Western education and Western schooling. You will hear me talk about epistemology and ontology a lot. And I think we tend to do that as academics, speak in these terms, forgetting that normal people don't speak like that. So usually I have another slide that explains what epistemology and ontology means. But for the sake of this audience, I'm assuming you all know. If you don't, very simply, ontology is just what we know. Epistemology is how we know what we know. This is the framework within I'm working within. I'll also mention something about coloniality. And the reason I do that when giving talks like this is because I find that in Nigeria, you mention coloniality and people think you're talking about colonialism and they think you're making an excuse for the state of Nigeria as it is today. They go back and say, well, colonialism has been over for so long. Why are you still mentioning it? We should be able to move on from that. And then you try to explain that it may be over, but there are living legacies in contemporary societies, often in the form of social discriminations, but really around cultural systems. So even though mine was an education PhD, I quickly found out that I was analyzing cultural practices and their effects on education, on politics, on everything else. So maybe I should go back and say, when I talk about politics in this paper, I'm talking about the politics of knowledge. So that knowledge and power dynamic, powerful knowledge that is powerful, and the resultant effects of that. That's what I mean when I talk about politics. And when I talk about knowledge, while I'm focusing on Western schooling as a locus of power relations, I'll be bringing in Quranic schooling as a form of contested knowledge that has been legitimized by a certain group of people in northern Nigeria. So this is what I'm functioning within. So what am I trying to do here today? I'm trying to do some things, and it's really hard trying to fashion this out. But I think maybe 3 key issues. I'm going to start by outlining these key issues. So Quranic schooling, known as Almajiranchi in northern Nigeria, which is a classical system of schooling really all over Muslim West Africa, but in Nigeria it's become a huge social issue because there's a reported 7 to 9 million boys within the system who are not considered to be in school. And that means they make up a large number of Nigerians out of school children, which in itself is a misnomer. They're in a school, just not a school that is seen as valid or valuable or even recognized in that way. And this is, so bear that in mind when I talk about the legitimization and contested knowledges. If you don't know enough about Quranic schooling in West Africa, in Nigeria, this is what it looks like. Young boys are sent off to live with a malam, a teacher, and it's an exclusive Quran-based curriculum. In Nigeria, what makes it different is that it's subject to various representational discourses, which have become very dominant. So if you went online and put an Almajiranchi, there'll be a particular kind of image that will come up. There'll be a particular kind of discourse that comes up. And this is what my PhD looked at. These particular discourses and the way they affect meaning making and the way they feed into representation. So even though I'm talking about discourses, I should also add another caveat. I am not a huge, I don't really quote Foucault like that. I make sense of discourse through the work of Stuart Hall. And Stuart Hall, it belonged to the Birmingham Cultural School and really did work on representation. And Hall talks about representation and says that the way we represent people is the way it affects how we go on to treat them. And I found that to be the case of Almajiri in northern Nigeria. So they've been subject to various representational discourses, like heavy derogatory terms. So in some places they've been called scars on the face of Nigeria, reservoirs of disease. People think they become Boko Haram members or thugs for hire. So I found 3 key discourses when I disaggregated them. One was that it's a retrograde and old system of knowledge, so no longer fit for the production of the modern Nigerian citizen, a delegitimized form of knowledge. People do not see the use for it. The first thing people ask is, what does it allow them to become? Can they become doctors? Can they become this? So people cannot comprehend that this is a legitimate system of knowledge for some people because it doesn't fit with their version of modernity. The second thing is that it produces dysfunctional adults, so Boko Haram members or thugs for hire or whatever else. The third discourse is that it's a child's right concern. This I find to be closest because obviously there are children on the streets and that cannot really be justified in the name of anything. And so then I would look at how these discourses really highlight existing politics of knowledge in post-colonial societies such as Nigeria. So why are discourses important? I think discourses are important because of their ability to guide what can be said and thought about in any particular era. It was Stuart Hall who said that in every era, some people have more power to set the agenda than others. So my key argument, I suppose, is that I'm interested in the ways that knowledge, be it the favored epistemology in the form of Western schooling, or the delegitimized Almajiranchi encounters power and the way that power encounters knowledge and what this can tell us about us as formerly colonized people. My key argument is that contestations over knowledge legitimacy, especially what is regarded as valid and valued knowledge, reinforce and are reinforced by this power-knowledge dynamic. And that the legacy of colonialism in the form of Western schooling includes a deprivileging of other forms of knowledges, and that it creates new forms of social difference and social stratifications, especially in Nigeria. What Western schooling has done is to give access to the perquisites of power. You cannot access power if you're not Western schooled. And that goes on to reinforce and close off other forms of knowledges. I'm going to turn it to my... So Western schooling is used for the maintenance of power structures, and also it acts as an exercise of power. I'm going to move on to, I've talked about the dominant representational discourses. I've talked about the way Almajiranchi, who apparently my niece is telling me I'm at 10 minutes. I'm going to have to whiz through. I've talked about the Almajiranchi's context. So I'm going to just touch on Nigerian elite. Like I said, Western schooling, and this is, I'm now going to go on to Thurston, who in his study of Islam modernization and decolonization highlighted how various colonial policies had unintended consequences, not least the emphasizing of the importance of modern education and formation of new kinds of Muslim intellectuals. So while we have Western schooling produce an elite class, it also opened up northern Nigeria to Arabophone countries, and these people came back with different modernizing visions. Key amongst that is the Izala movement as well, who kind of like just no longer understood this version of West African Islam that Almajiranchi draws on, and then led to new forms of contestations. First was the doing away with Bid'ah innovations. The second was epistemological changes and the modes of Islamic schooling, new forms of schools, such as the Islamia movements, new forms of ideological attacks, new forms of dramatic imbalances of power. Baba in 2014 observed how the reform of Islamic education undertaken by these elites opened up new pedagogical spaces. And what this did was to enable lay Muslims to have direct access to scriptural knowledge and then bypass mediatory roles of traditional religious institutions such as the Malamai. This monopoly of education that was formerly enjoyed by the Malamai became threatened, because the Malamai in particular came under immense criticism from these reformist ulamas who critiqued them and almost said that they didn't have the authority to pass on the knowledge in the way that they did. And so we have two forms of modernizing elite, through Western schooling, then through a combination of Western schooling and opening up of Northern Nigeria to other influences. I'm going to move on because I'm really short on time, and I've talked about the resultant epistemological prejudices due to these new forms of knowledge, but also how epistemology feeds into ontology, ontology feeds into epistemology. There's a certain ontological security that comes from this form of knowledge, from what we know. It feeds into our subjectivities, it feeds into our sense of self, it feeds into who we think we are, and therefore affects our meaning making at a really fundamental level. So when epistemology is centralized as a source of conflict in the way that this paper attempts to do, it emphasizes the importance of something like Western schooling in shaping social, cultural, political, and the educational landscape. So new forms of power structures are created, new modalities are created, new subjectivities are created, and subsequently new forms of power relations. So this is what brings me to the contested knowledges and legitimacies. When you look at something as benign as representational discourses about Almajiranchi is not that benign. It serves as a discursive formation. It serves to delegitimize a knowledge form, and by extension, it serves to those who do not have access to the favored dominant epistemology, and then feeds into this power knowledge dynamic. I'm going to stop here. I'm sure I haven't finished, but hopefully I can answer some more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much for that fascinating and compelling presentation. Do we have any questions?
I'm okay with no questions, by the way.
No. I will, may I exercise my, oh, okay. I see that Professor Ali Du has her hand up. Please unmute yourself, Professor, and ask your question.
Thank you so much, Professor Holla. It's really a comment to say how brilliant and timely the wonderful work of Dr. Hadiza Abdul Rahman is. It's timely. So I'm just very grateful that she can be before my presentation to position it. So you have done the work, and I'm just humbled by that. Thank you. I hope the book is, you are working to publish the book. That's
Don't
the other question.
Me.
Yes.
I can't do it. I need your work. I need your help. I'm going to come and stay in your house and do it.
You are welcome anytime.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Abdul Rahman. There are a few questions coming in, but we are pressed for time. Maybe we'll be able to circle back to them at the end. So thank you so much. And I think, as Professor Ali Du has said, you've provided an excellent foundation and segue for her presentation. So Professor Ali Du, we'll turn things over to you now.
Okay, I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to Professor Gundenayake for inviting me, and Professor Robert Versen, Professor Dufalo Ashley, and Professor Cynthia Haller Fatton. I'm really grateful to each one of you, and I'm very humbled by your invitation to be again in a panelist with two of the seniors who have really welcomed my work at the time that they didn't know me, which added a great value to even how I appreciated their embrace of my work and their insightful feedback to me. This is Professor Abdulkader Tayeb. I benefited from a generous library that he gave me, and also reading my manuscript, giving feedback to me and inviting me to discuss my work. And Professor Olupona, Jacob Olupona too, I'm really grateful to you for welcoming my work at a boarding in Southern Maine University, where we first met, and later on at Harvard. And to Dr. Ogundenayake, at Harvard, we started the conversation, and I'm grateful to you for inviting me once more to continue a dialogue with my sister, Professor Hadiza Abdul Rahman, who are continuing the work. So we are building communities as a feminist African Muslim women to bring an African Muslim and feminist perspective to this dialogue in a way that really opens up, creates space for us to rethink what she rightly said, which epistemologies, which ontologies, and the power relation that defines which system of knowledge is privileged as discourses of modernity. So I'm really grateful to each one of you. So we have changed the order. So it's not undermining your invitation that I go first, but I think expressing gratitude is important. At a time where I was writing, I was in the margin, and there are great people these are the great people who supported my work to say it's really, it has a place. So this is why I defer to them. and thank you. So for today, I'm using, again, a humanistic approach, feminist, African humanistic and Islamic perspective to look at the ways in which African Muslims in the House of Societies have contributed as artists in tackling, in contributing to the struggle to fight against the corona pandemic, but at the same time to bring, to position an alternative ways of looking at an ethics of care that looks at the population who, by virtue of being marginalized and disenfranchised by the moral economy of abundance imposed by neoliberalism, which in the earlier period set its foundations through the structural adjustment program, which dismantled African public health infrastructure and lead also to the displacement of African capability, African government and states capability to continue producing a body of doctors, nurses, and social workers who can empower African citizens. So what happened when you are we are faced with a pandemic such as the corona-19 pandemic, and the population have been suffering from the lack of public health infrastructure, the lack of a moral economy of sustenance, the lack of investment in critical literacy to allow them to understand what they are facing. So even governments were faced with the reality to realize that the neoliberal policies that they have adopted through this elite control of governance has now come to bite them, including the elite themselves, who cannot run to abroad for medical care and who cannot attend to the population needs. So they cannot, how can they adopt policies of lockdown where social welfare measurement have not been approached? So I'm really grateful that Professor Tayob and Professor Jacob and also Professor Hadiza have presented earlier to look at the context within which COVID happens and what are the resources and how the population were confronted with the violence of governance and the question of corruptions that were explained earlier. So, but I'm interested in looking at the ethics of care, how critical literacy through the ways in which health messaging was articulated by artists who use spirituality and use also the vernacular approach to communicate and sensitize the population about critical health issues in the course of pandemic by resorting to epistemologies within the cultures, by looking at also ways in which they can empower the African states, African governments, African public health practitioners, and not to only adopt and the medical doctor, not to only look at the pandemic, whether it is the COVID or Ebola or any other disease, only from a biomedical approach. So one of the artists whose work I have used, I would like to share the PowerPoint if it's possible. Is Aminu Allah, and he's a northern Nigerian. Do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we do. Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to to focus on his work, because when we are looking at the discourses that are produced by the people themselves, it is very important to look at other texts, other archives that enable us to see how populations are responding to the conditions they are in and the type of solutions that they are proposing. So I would like, having said that, I want to use a critical discourse analysis to look at the ways in which African artists, such as Aminu Alan Waka, are contributing to the fight against the COVID pandemic. It is most African government adopted social distancing and lockdown policies have been met by strong resistance from large numbers of their population who are facing economic deprivation in the absence of humanitarian food and material relief from the government and non-government organizations. Aside from this concrete economic grievance, most African population have needed to be educated on the public danger of COVID-19 in vernacular mediums and vernacular communication strategies that they trust and understand. The aim here in my analysis, therefore, is to provide a critical discourse analysis of Hausa poetic narrative related to COVID-19 pandemic as a framework for understanding the socio-cultural ecology, political economy, and ethical dimensions of the pandemic in Nigeria, Niger, and other West African countries where Hausa is spoken, and in the diaspora worldwide. Furthermore, COVID-19 pandemic has brought to light the condition of disenfranchisement and vulnerability in Hausa Muslim society in a manner that called for public action. I argue that Muslim poets in Hausa society are composing and performing vernacular poetry that constitute an important humanistic archive that critique neoliberal structural adjustment programs and governance have how governance have engendered economic marginality and other forms of social vulnerability for most of the population whose lives are controlled by ethno-regional hegemonic cultural and political patriarchal oligarchs in society. Their critique rightly point out that such condition of disenfranchisement and marginality have made the underprivileged population more vulnerable to COVID-19 pandemic. Who is Aminu Allah? Aminu Allah examined the contribution from Aminu Allah. I would like to give a poetic autobiography of how he sees himself. He said, in this poem, Luluje Chikinjuji, this is somebody who receive both Quranic Islamic education and formal education. But in this poem, as a critique of elite corruption and the neglect of the youth in the area of employment, he called himself Luluje Chikinjuji. That is a pearl in the garbage bin. I, Aminu, I am not a son of a king, nor a prince. I, Aminu, am not a politician, nor has political power. I, Aminu, am not the son of a wealthy person, nor a rich. I, Aminu, am not the son of a religious leader, nor am I a religious leader. I am Aminu, I'm not a radio or TV worker, nor an owner of media house. However, God has blessed me with the power of the spoken word, yet I have become the shiny pearl from the garbage, praised by thousands of your lights. So that is how he presents himself. That is to show the rebellious part who dimension of his work, who will not compromise his arts, but lend it at the service of a really ethical critique in what is happening in a society. I'm applying a critical discourse analysis, Aminu Islamic Sufi-inspired emotive coronavirus, corona awareness song, and he entitled the song, Hasbi Allah, Allah is enough. It is worth noting that for his new Hausa song to sensitize his million of fans within Nigeria, Niger, and beyond, Aminu Alan Wakari appropriates the same title of a protest song, Hasbi Allahu, Allah is enough, that led to his censorship by Kano Board of Censorship Court and his arrest in Kano in July 4th, 29. Without imposing religious dogmatism as experienced with the ultra-conservative modernist pro-Wahhabist political Islam in northern Nigeria called Izala, Aminu Allah Wakari uses the serviceable features of Islam, especially Islamic ethics of care, to console the vulnerable masses about the coronavirus pandemic, while also using Islamic language to underscore the critical importance of following the life-saving precautionary measures recommended by modern medical doctors and public health workers. In his poem song, using the same Islamic pious ethics of care, he praises the medical doctors and nurses for their professional devotion in risking their own lives to save the lives of others in continuing the race for a vaccine against COVID-19. His secular, pure Sufi-inspired message in support of modern biomedical approaches is in sharp contrast to the position of Muslim religious fanatics who completely reject modern biomedical therapy and cling closely to Islamic healing. By the same token, Aminu Allah also endorses the incorporation of spirituality and Islamic ethics in consoling anxious populations against a disease for which there is not yet a cure. Alan Wakari's song examined the psychological, cosmological, and ethical dimension of the coronavirus pandemic, which are often overlooked in biomedical and public health in past pandemic in Africa, especially when dealing with its impact on underprivileged communities. It calls on the government to responsibly provide much needed material relief to underprivileged communities by supplying them with food, water, health supplies during the pandemic lockdown, but also appeals to individuals and communities' pure ethics of care in contributing to the fight against COVID-19. This failure to look at pandemic from religious, spiritual, and ethical perspectives, as well as from multicultural perspective, resulted in the high price paid in human lives during both the 2014 Ebola pandemic and the HIV pandemic, and many studies by Stone, Fraser, Toko, and others have shown. The song, Hasbi Allahu, underscores the notion that religion and spirituality matter for public health and for cultural embrace on biomedical therapy. This understanding is what led the World Innovation Summit in health and on health and the Qatar Foundation to convene from the studio at Northwestern University, a conference in Doha entitled, quote, Coronavirus, the Interplay of Medical and Islamic Ethics. And the webinar is available online. The title of Alan Wakari's song against the COVID-19 pandemic, Hasbi Allah, intertextually speaks of the Quranic verse, Surat Al-Imran, Hasbinallahu wa ni'mal wakil. Allah alone is sufficient for us, and he is the best disposer of affairs for us. When the elite corruption, as the previous presenters have suggested, the moral corruption and the impact of the lack of ethics of governance. This verse is used by Muslims to seek solace in the face of hardship, such as political tyranny, as when he and his art community were confronted by the Kano Islamist morality police in 2009. Currently, with the calamity of the COVID pandemic, the entire Niger nations, and indeed the world, are experiencing fear and anxiety about the deadly coronavirus disease and the hardship triggered by the sudden Nigerian government lockdown and social distancing policies. Aminu Alan Waka first opens his secular, meditative, and rhyming poem with an emotional awakened zikr, consisting of the repetitive invocation of the praise names of God to inspire meditative centeredness and psychological attentiveness to God before imploring his divine mercy for humanity in the face of the corona pandemic. Zikr is a common meditative invocation in Sufi poetic traditions practiced not only in Muslim northern Nigeria and Niger societies, but also in other parts of the world where this poetry and performance genre is called Allah's poetry, God's poetry, such as in Sufi Persian poetry and Sufi Asian ghazal, as the work of Safi suggests.
Professor, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to ask you to begin to wrap up, please.
Right. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So I want to say that the use of this, he uses this sermonic. In addition to the poetry, he also uses another genre that is often appropriated by extremist Islamic conservatives, such as the Wa'azi, to dismiss to discourage population to adopt public health measures that are important for their survival. In his work, also, like other artists who have been critiquing through the use of other means to expose and to speak to issues of injustices, such as denial of critical literacy, denial of material resources to population. Some artists have used humor as a radical hope, but Aminu Allah, what he has used is to look at poetry and the place of this Islamic sermonic space, such as Wazi, to decenter them from just the control of the political control of religion and of population to be exposed to healthy public health messaging. He appropriated this same space, secularized them, and then speak in the vernacular and the spiritual way that will allow populations to have consolation out of this, the violence of the information about the pandemic, and also the violence of being confronted with the reality that one cannot even have basic water, basic mobility to go look for resources for the upkeep of the family. So I just want to stop it here, since we all have the papers. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that fascinating paper. Do we have any questions? I'm not seeing any. So, Professor Tayob has a question. Please unmute yourself, Professor.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for this fascinating paper. I mean, I also enjoyed reading it. This archive. I wanted to ask something about how it is presented. How are these poems presented? I mean, are they put in song, or are they put in music as such? Maybe to give you some, if I could get an idea about how popular it is, how it is is it only one person who is doing it, or is it something? Does it become part of a broader public, archive as such?
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Tayob. Yes, it is. What is fascinating is that at the beginning, UNESCO and many institutions have called for artists to participate in the production of public health messaging. But even prior to the UNESCO call, what was fascinating about artists such as Aminu Allah and others like in Niger, we have other house of performers who have joined in constituting texts, especially because they saw narratives, critical health literacy, and political critique that are really very important archival resources. And that's what I've used during the pandemic. My way of handling the pandemic is actually going into that archive, which is available on the digital, and they were disseminating the same way people are talking about disinformation and dissemination. I wanted us to really give credit to these artists who have used the other path to say, no, we cannot afford to politicize a pandemic. What is critical is to realize that we are dealing with a huge population who were denied resources, and we have to produce narratives that allow them to understand rather than increase their marginalization by producing media, whether it's radio or television narratives that increases their fear and anxiety. So we have a body of texts that are available, disseminated through WhatsApp. For instance, there were Nigerian and Niger and Ghanaian House speakers when the pandemic was announced in China, and they produced really hip hop songs in Hausa language to say, we are medical students at the center in Wuhan. Here's how the perspective. So in this book that is coming out soon, I hope this year with the University of Michigan Press, my book will be coming. And this is part of the work I have done to expose in all humility, the public, academic public, the public health public, the cultural public about this kind of intervention and how Muslims respond to reality in the digital platform, whether it's WhatsApp, whether it is private TV or radio. And the speed at which I was interested at the speed at which the artists intervene in a way that no government was able to do it. And also to harness both spirituality and both indigenous spirituality, Abrahamic spirituality, the modes of communications that are palatable to the population. This is the archives that I'm interested in, and looking at also the multifaceted ways in which they use several texts, orality, the visual, the written, to educate. So this is a multiple level of interacting critical literacies, right? And as Dr. Abdurrahman Hadiza suggested, when we alienate epistemologists that work for population, it is really another injury to human rights and population rights to have their system of knowledge, their system of processing, and also contributing to solutions. Because once the vernacular is used, right, and through the demystification of language, displacing the hierarchy that coloniality has imposed on what is the legitimate language, the legitimate script, who is legitimate to produce knowledge system and solutions that can assist people in saving life. I think it's very important that we look at the role of this agent, cultural agent, such as the Hausa artists and all African artists who have used really African languages, and also ethics, piety, from the point of view of the population. No, as Professor Olupona has suggested, that it is very critical that we look at the civic religion rather than the political, the politicization of religion and spirituality. And so once we look at the civic use of spirituality and religion and cosmology, the diversity of cosmologies, we can see the ways in which we can arrive at a social justice approach to a pandemic that is palatable and that also shows African genius and African contribution to a pandemic that is affecting the world. So those are the kind of elements I'm discussing. Maybe if the time will permit, I can give a little bit of the song to show also the cosmopolitanism of the discourse, because African government at the moment where the World Health Organization declared the pandemic, they did not have the infrastructure for critical visual literacy for people to understand how the system of contamination works, right? And what they have imposed is to look at the police or the military to go impose lockdown and the violence that started. I will play just a little bit of, if you will permit me, to see how the different narrative and visualization, or you, if it's possible, okay.
In fact, Professor, I'm afraid we have to move on to the final paper.
Oh, okay, yes, there is a final paper. Sorry, I don't mean to.
That is all right.
Yeah, all respect. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right. So now we will move to Professor Ogunaike, who is going to read Professor Bongba's paper.
Thank you very much to our panelists and to our chair for organizing this wonderful panel. As you may have noticed, I am not Professor Bongba. He sends his deep regrets. He's currently in Botswana, where there's a power outage, so he's unable to join us. But he's asked me to read his paper, and I'll try to do my best, even though I do not have the gravitas of Professor Bongba. So he says, the generous invitation that was extended to me by Professor Ogunaike gave me an opportunity to start with or comment on my own book, The Dialectics of Transformation in Africa, published nearly 16 years ago. I thought this was a way of saying that some stories are worth repeating so that people can begin to ask you questions about your own excesses in language. In that book, written during the high noon of Afro-pessimism, I described the human, or one could say the non-human condition in Africa as marked and created by the privatization of power, the pauperization of the state, the prodigalization of the state, and the proliferation of violence. What I intended the readers was to see was that the long struggle to redeem Africa from domination of its space, the dehumanization of its soul, the destabilization of its sociality, and the destruction of its society had entered a new dispensation in the Fanonian sense, because the new leaders claimed to understand the principles of liberty and justice for all. These new leaders who claimed to understand these things would not implement what they had learned in the white man's school. Instead, they learned other lessons, how to continue to treat their populations as colonial subjects, not citizens. I also wanted readers to understand that what was happening in the post-colony was a sort of repetition, or better still, a nefarious acquiescence to the Hegelian spirit, which announced that Africa lacked aspects of life and thought worthy of universalizing. At the time I wrote The Dialectics of Transformation in Africa, the continent was living, some would have said, on the precipice of collapse, and the leaders faced a resilient population at home who summoned the will to live in a world of global economic marginalization that was fueled by a trinity of evils: a global extractive economy that was carting away at an unbelievable scale and pace the wealth of the continent, voracious power elites who facilitated this extraction, but participated in building the economies of the Western world through the illicit transfer of wealth from the wealth of Africa to the West. And third, an international economic and financial system whose genesis lay in the Bretton Woods agreements, which stepped up to the plate and offered the costly program of adjustment with growth. The challenge in writing the book was not only that I wondered if I will tell the story of the pain of Africa, but also map out the possibilities that have been placed on the table, but end up with a theological reflection that would suggest the possibility of rebirth grounded by love for Africa, because the book was a non-traditional political theology. African theologians have been engaged in political or public theology in different ways, inviting readers to appreciate the complexity of theology and politics, but have always seen their theology and praxis in both the Aristotelian terms, where praxis was used to describe the, is this? Apologies. Praxis was used to describe the engagement of free members of the political community. Liberation theologians employed the term as it was used by progressive thinkers in the tradition of Marx, Lucas, Adorno, and Marcuse, working with the enormous theoretical transformations by the Frankfurt School. Other key thinkers that would influence liberation theologians included Paulo Freire, who addressed the pedagogy of the oppressed. Now, Professor Bongba turns to the Anglophone crisis in Cameroon and writes, in 2016, Anglophone lawyers and teachers started a strike to protest two things. First, they complained that the government of Cameroon had transferred Francophone teachers to the Anglophone zone of the country to teach important subjects, especially STEM. And since they taught these subjects in French or sometimes broken English, the Anglophone children were not properly served. The result of such education was that it slowed down Anglophone students and hurt their performance at higher institutions, hindering their ability to find work and contribute to their own livelihood in the economy of the country. The teachers were joined by Anglophone lawyers who argued that the Francophone judges and magistrates who did not study English law were being sent to the Anglophone region as presiding magistrates, and since they did not know the Anglophone legal system, the people in the two Anglophone regions were not being served justice. The stalemate that started with a strike by the teachers and lawyers was taken up by leading Anglophone activists as an opportunity to call on the government to restore the federated state in which all sectors of the country would be treated with respect. When this did not happen, some leaders of the Anglophone movement declared the two Anglophone regions independent, and they proclaimed that they had restored the Republic of Ambazonia. The Anglophone leaders claimed that the government responded to this by declaring war. Ambazonian leaders established a government in exile in Nigeria, but the Nigerian government collaborated with the Cameroon government, and the leaders who were in Nigeria were returned to Cameroon and imprisoned at the central prison in Yaoundé. Fighting escalated throughout the Anglophone region as both the Anglophone fighters and government troops targeted each other, killing many people, especially non-combatant civilians. Now, the International Crisis Group pointed out that the Catholic Church in Cameroon could play a significant role in the civil war. The Catholic Church is important because President Paul Biya is a faithful Catholic who's visited the Vatican, and Pope Benedict XVI paid 2 papal visits to Cameroon. One cannot speculate what promoted such visits, which are really elaborate and very expensive, but it's a much better way of using money that all other things can be done with the money in Cameroon. Cameroonian Christians, including Protestants, have a great respect for the Catholic hierarchy. All Cameroonians, except for a few, were very glad when the Christian Cardinal Toumi was elevated to College of Cardinals. He published a book on his difficult relationship with former President Ahidjo and with President Biya, making a case for the way Cameroon was governed and how he was perceived negatively by the two leaders. So the Anglophone bishops at the Anglophone Conference of Bishops in Cameroon in the 1990s brought together Anglophones from all major political parties in the country, and the main topic centered on the mistreatment of Anglophones in Cameroon, arguing that they were treated as second-class citizens. The bishops argued that the government of Cameroon under Ahidjo, the previous president, had abused the political goodwill that created the Federal Republic of Cameroon by ignoring the Fumban Accords that established the structure of the republic, when this President Ahidjo, without debate, pushed through a referendum in 1972 to unify the country as a united Republic of Cameroon. Third, the bishops argued that the English language, one of the official languages Cameroon has adopted, had been undermined not only by citizens, but more so by the state, with the majority of Francophone leaders from office staff to ministers not willing to use English in official business. Anglophone students who attended the University of Yaoundé in the 1970s spoke of the challenge of taking classes in French, and even professors who made fun of English. Fourth, the Anglophone bishops raised the question of the 1992 presidential elections, pointing out that it was widely reported that Ni John Fruindi, the Anglophone founder of the Social Democratic Front, actually won the elections, but the elections were rigged in order to give victory to Paul Biya. Fifth, the bishop stated that one could argue that multi-party democracy was now a part of the Cameroonian political landscape, even though there was really no semblance of national sovereignty, and this made political arrangement in the country incapable of addressing the many challenges it faced. So the Anglophone bishops sent a letter to the President of the Republic, developing an argument along these lines. They pointed out that President Ahidjo's radical step of dissolving all political parties in 1966 to form a single political party was, in their words, the greatest political act of the demolition of democracy, in which regional positions, ministerial positions were handpicked by the president and the head of the party, Ahidjo. Second, the Anglophone bishops argued that the second major problem was a 1984 law that amended the constitution, rather than naming the country a Federal Republic of Cameroon, used the name of the former French-speaking East Cameroon, the Republic of Cameroon. According to the bishops, this was a deliberate and systematic erosion of West Cameroonian cultural identity, which the 1961 Constitution sought to preserve and protect by providing for a bicultural federation. Third, rather than sit down and discuss the many issues raised by Anglophones, the government tried to suppress these conversations about the fate of Anglophones in the country. They argued that the government leaders failed to address these concerns and employed brutal tactics to punish people who were merely expressing their political disagreements with the overall Francophone political ethos of the country. Fourth, the bishops in their letter pointed out that the nation was at loggerheads because the government had done a poor job in the deployment and distribution of human and economic resources. They pointed to the uneven distribution of positions of leadership, favoring Francophones. At the time they wrote the letter in 2016, they illustrated this disparity, noting that 36 ministers went before the National of Cameroon to defend their budgets, but only one minister was Anglophone. They pointed out that in Cameroon, important government ministries like defense, finance, territorial administration, and economy were reserved mostly for Francophones. Fifth, the bishops raised questions about the fate of the English language in Cameroon, and Anglophones have complained about the way the language is treated as a second class and its speakers are treated as second class citizens. They've protested that, but to no avail. The texts of the country are largely produced in French. National entrance examinations are in French. The bishops pointed out that ministers, directors general, heads of parastatals, senior divisional officers, heads of law enforcement institutions are disproportionately Francophone, and there seems to have been a conscious effort made to flood the Northwest and Southwest regions with Francophone heads of state. At the heart of the teachers' strike and the lawyer strike was the complaint that even in Cameroonian courts, the majority of magistrates were Francophone. Sixth, the bishops pointed out that the state had mismanaged the West patrimony of West Cameroon. To begin, the Anglophone region had been neglected economically, but to add injury to the insult, the government had siphoned away from the Anglophones their patrimony and left them in economic crises. So that is natural resources, oil, and other things from the West Cameroonian region were going to, the profits of that were going to other regions, Francophone regions. Seventh, the bishops called attention to a number of things which had been described by the Anglophones as the Anglophone problem. Access to state and professional schools were difficult for Anglophones, even when they were qualified, even when they're bilingual. This frustration caused hindrances when Francophones called Anglophones Biafran, called them enemies in the house and traitors, and this language was used by government officials, but no one seemed to complain about such acts in derogatory language. Eighth, the bishops called on the head of state to acknowledge and face the problem. They recommended that the president should engage in a dialogue about resolving the acts of discrimination against the Anglophones. They pointed out that leaders like former French President Jacques Chirac, the British Commonwealth, the European Union have all recognized that there's an Anglophone problem and called for a dialogue. The bishops stated that they consider church teachings that bear on a situation like the one in Cameroon, writing, quote, "A just society can become a reality only when it is based on the respect of the transcendent dignity of the human person. Every political, economic, social, scientific, and cultural program must be inspired by the awareness of the primacy of each human being over society. For this reason, neither his life nor the development of his thought nor his good, nor those who are part of his personal and social activities can be subjected to unjust restrictions in the exercise of their rights and freedom." Secondly, they wrote, "It is in light of this that we propose that the government should immediately withdraw the forces of law and order from the streets of Anglophone towns to which they have been deployed, open proper investigations into any abuses of human rights by the forces of law and order, and release or charge those who have been locked up as a result of the recent unrest. In this way, we would have a better climate for the negotiations which have been proposed between the government and teachers and lawyers. Promote justice for all people." All 7 Anglophone Catholic bishops signed this letter. And Professor Bongba concludes discussing political theology in light of this situation in Cameroon, noting that this is not a uniquely Cameroonian problem, but as Professor Mamdani spoke about earlier, is a kind of general problem of the nation state, the creation of these permanent majorities and minorities. He says that the Ambazonian leaders who took refuge in Nigeria learned a hard lesson that Nigeria could not provide cover for them, perhaps an indication of where Nigeria stands on the crises. The AU, the African Union, is missing in action here. Professor Bongwa says, I still think that the bishop's letter offers a viable path. In the interim, I think that their call that the country should implement the earlier 1996 federal constitution, which spelled out decentralization, which could have broken the centralized system, which had compromised the democratic promise and experiment in Cameroon, making the country a makeshift apparatus where rights were not respected. He writes, as I think of the challenges in Cameroon today, I'm reminded of Achille Mbembe's remark in the 1990s that Cameroon displayed a venality and evasion seen only in failed states like then Zaire. Mbembe had argued that earlier, democracy was an illusion, even in the context of multi-party Cameroon. It is clear that while the 1996 constitution was a hopeful sign, there is no doubt that much of the gains that could have been made at that time with the rise of opposition and multi-party system were captured and tamed by the all-powerful state apparatus in Yaoundé. The hopes of independence and unification were destroyed by a centralized state, and the same opportunity of decentralization proposed by the 1996 constitution could have paved the way for a solution to the discrimination which the Anglophone sector still faces and still suffers from today. I still believe genuine decentralization, which must include the dissolution of the centralized state as it exists today, still offers a viable path forward. Such decentralization would offer Cameroonians an opportunity to rethink the idea of the state outside the boundaries of colonial legacies of Anglophone and Francophone, and invite all in the political community of Cameroon to listen, dialogue, negotiate, and come up with a democratic, decentralized, and depersonalized system that is not grounded on hero worship, which in the case of Cameroon would be a wake-up call for the masses who have only known two presidents since independence, that is Amadou Ahidjo and Paul Biya. Then he concludes, Professor Bongwa concludes describing a horrible massacre in his own village conducted by the Cameroonian state forces. And he describes this with reference to Professor Mamdani's When Victims Become Killers, saying that Mamdani argued for things like this, we have to think about these things and not just throw up our hands and say this is unthinkable. We can analyze human tragedies like this because the causes lie in the abuse of politics and power. We can have a civil, legal, cultural, and rational discourse about this, even in an age when the art of science and science of reason is in short supply. One then could and should argue that much of the violence which the residents of Ngarbu, this region and village, and millions of people in the post-colony have suffered and continues to suffer is rooted and grounded in the practice of politics and power. Mamdani writes, quote, political identities exist in their own right. They are a direct consequence of the history of state formation and not necessarily of market or cultural formation. If economic identities are a consequence of the history of development of markets and cultural identities in the development of communities that share a common language and meaning, political identities need to be understood as a specific consequence of the history of state formation. When it comes to the modern state, political identities are inscribed in law. In the first instance, they are legally enforced. End quote. As I have argued, if we are to look for the source of evil in the post-colonial state, we must look at the organization of state power. And here Mamdani argues that those arrangements tell us who belongs, and these are not merely cultural, but legal instruments that are brought to bear. These legal instruments enforce civic citizenship, which refer to all who live in the country, but ethnic citizenship refer to membership in particular of a particular ethnic group, thus creating a bipolar nature of belonging, which continues to haunt the post-colony today. As it turns out, these divisions have been the source of many problems, and the text of constitutions adopted in the different countries could have been different, but the temptation to resort back to these early colonial formations was too great and eventually won the day. So he concludes again by looking at a theoretical and theological solution to this problem, arguing that the Catholic Church should play an important role in this reformation of the state, based on the sanctity of human life. So he writes kind of a preliminary basis of this. He said, first, one should recognize that political communities are human institutions created to build and promote the common good. They're spaces for various human experience and experiments. In such a context, the thing to do is ask how we can understand the affirmations of the sacred text of the Christian tradition, which indicate that humanity was created in the image of God. That image comes in a human body, but what is important from the perspective of the Christian proclamation is that each individual carries a piece of the divine being. If you are a bearer of the image of God, the God I worship, one would think that a theological application that stems from this would be that I should respect you. Humans are made to live in community. In growing cosmopolitan spaces, which we occupy today, you don't get to choose who you interact with, but it's clear from a theological perspective that humans are made to live in community, and these implications can be explored in many directions, but we are invited to recognize and respect difference where boundaries become blurred to the extent that one begins to take the other, here drawing on Emmanuel Levinas, for granted. One ought to do a third thing, to restore difference, to reaffirm the notion that the other is inviolable and ought to be seen as an independent other who must be respected and engaged in political practice on his or her own terms. In other words, while this might sound paradoxical, a theology of difference ought to invite members of the political community to respect the inviolability of the other, who is also part of the community that we share. And he says, third, whether it is the Catholic Church or other Christian communities, the fact that humans bear the image of God and are created to live in community invites members of this political community to recognize and promote the dignity of each person. Religious communities and the Christian tradition with which I'm familiar makes it clear that God values each human life, and one way of thinking about this is the fact that each individual is invested with dignity. The Christian church in Cameroon can do a lot of good if they look beyond Anglophone and Francophone identities and ask the question, what is the best way to promote and respect the dignity of the other person? If this is done, Cameroonians will begin to realize that calling names and taking a stand behind Anglophone or Francophone identity at the expense of the full person created in the image of God misses that mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm pleased that we got to hear the paper, even though Professor Bomba couldn't be with us. Well, we are actually out of time. To conclude, I would like to thank the speakers immensely for their excellent papers and the stimulating conversation that followed. I wish we had more time for conversation, but we thank you wholeheartedly. As a reminder, this session will be recorded. It will be available soon on the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab's Vimeo site, and a link will be shared with all the attendees. We hope that you will join us again at 1 p.m. for New Theories and the Future of Religion and Democracy in Africa. A Zoom link for the next panel can be found on the conference website. Thank you again, and hope to see you in an hour or so.